All right, hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. So today our speaker is going to be Ben Laufer. He's a PhD student in the School of Computing and Information Sciences at Cornell, where he's working with Helen Nissenbaum and John Kleinberg. He's like working with the AI Policy and Practice Group and also the Digital Life Initiative, and he does a lot of work on data-driven algorithmic systems and their implications for the public interest. He's going to tell us today about his work on regulation along the AI development pipeline for fairness, safety, and related goals. And yeah, your turn.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just want to thank Juba for setting up this talk and also let me share my screen. Can you all see? Cool. Um, so I just minimized the window, so I hope I can see if people raise their hands, but feel free to um, interrupt or ask questions throughout. Um, and yeah, I just want to say a lot of this work and a lot of the Simon's fairness theory people have inspired me, and so I'm happy to be here talking about what I've been thinking about and working on. So I've called this regulation along the AI development pipeline for fairness, safety, and related goals. Um, and I thought I'd just take a minute to um, start with sort of like what interests me or what motivates me to do my research. And for a couple years at the beginning of PhD, when people would ask what I'm interested in, I would always give this forward response: societal implications of algorithms. And I sort of think as time has gone on, I've realized that pretty much anyone who's working on computing or algorithms is in some sense touching the societal implications, especially as computing becomes more and more widespread across a variety of domains. And so I sort of wanted to pin down what actually within this kind of inspires some of my work. And so there are two cases that sort of help me think through the richness of variety of related questions in this area. The first is I was out to dinner a few months ago, and after the meal, instead of being shown a paper bill, as I had been used to, I was shown one of these interfaces that have become increasingly common. And this one actually was different from most of the other interfaces that I had seen. And the reason it was different was because the tip amounts were listed in not in ascending order. And somehow this really bothered me, and I wasn't really able to articulate at first why this was annoying to me. But thinking about it, it sort of made me realize that what used to be an interaction just between a diner and a waiter now has this intermediary that is thinking about a variety of like economic interests and incentives in interaction that didn't used to be digitally mediated. And so my like wanting to give a low tip just to signal to the intermediary that I didn't want to be part of an A/B test where they change the order of the tip amounts would actually affect my waiter in some way. And so I had to sort of balance these competing thoughts and navigate this more complex ecosystem. The other example that I really like, I didn't come up with, but one of my advisors, Helen Nissenbaum, who's done a lot of theorizing about privacy, uh, some of what inspired her was this Google Street View example. Google Street View was a product that launched in like I think the mid 2000s, and it was essentially a bunch of photos that became available to anyone with internet access of people on the street. And after it was launched, there was a backlash because people felt their privacy had been violated. So I really like the first sentence of this article. One man is seen picking his nose at a street corner, a couple are caught sunbathing in bikinis, and another man is captured entering an adult bookstore. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that technology throws norms and behaviors into flux. And when this happens, we need sort of foundational notions to enable analysis. And in the case of this privacy example, I think this inspired Helen's work, establishing that there may be expectations of privacy even when people are in public, because Google's response to this backlash was we were just taking photos in public. And so I think like when technology gets introduced, we need some of these foundations to understand what's really going on. And so I like this quote that I'll just read quickly from John Rawls. The work of abstraction is not gratuitous, not abstraction for abstraction's sake. Rather, it is a way of continuing public discussion when shared understandings of lesser generality have broken down. We should be prepared to find that the deeper the conflict, the higher the level of abstraction to which we must ascend to get a clear and uncluttered view of its roots. And so in light of that, I took this like opportunity to list out some of my work that tries to uh, uh, paint this kind of ecosystem around AI development. And broadly, the categories that I came to were sort of modeling and multi-agent interactions, especially the economic interests and social implications in these interactions in AI development, fair machine learning and satisfying objectives over the set of good models or the set of possible models in especially in classification. And then I have other work in sort of trustworthy content generation and accountability. But today I'm just going to talk about two of these papers in two of these sort of streams. Okay, so the topic that unites these two papers that I want to talk about is they both sort of touch the regulation of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I went ahead and Google image searched regulation of AI and got this image. And I think if anything suggests that we need better abstractions for understanding this topic, it's that this is the image that comes up representing this topic. And the sort of features of machine learning and artificial intelligence that I think are probably important to capture or talk about conceptually include these two. There may be more, but two are sort of front of mind for me. The first is that there are multiple important sort of attributes or ways to measure or appraise successful or unsuccessful performance in machine learning. And the second is that there are multiple purposes or contexts where machine learning algorithms may be put to use. And roughly, the first part of my talk will focus on this first attribute above, and the second will focus on the second. Okay, so part one is what constitutes a less discriminatory algorithm. And my collaborators for this project are Manish Raghavan at MIT and Solon Barocas at Microsoft Research. And what I want to talk about in this part of my talk is a concept that touches both law and computer science, especially theoretical computer science. And what I want to do is discuss why we need computation to sort of fully understand this concept that comes to us from the law, and also what this concept teaches us about sort of like the limits of a computational lens on these topics. And the topic that I'm talking about was already part of the title of the part one, so it wasn't really much of a surprise, but it's the quote unquote less discriminatory algorithm. And broadly, the idea is that according to current disparate impact doctrine, if you want to show that a policy is discriminatory, one step that you might need to take is to prove that there was an alternative policy that had lower disparate impact, but that still serves the same needs of the business or of the original decision maker. And so the question is there a process for arriving at a policy that equally meets the goals of the decision maker with less of a disparate impact? And there's a number of questions that come up pretty quickly if we try to think about how we might operationalize or formally think about this search for a less discriminatory algorithm. And one of these ambiguities is about the purpose. So you might ask if a process exists for finding a less discriminatory alternative, We might think of it as a sort of like proactive or forward-looking step that the firm or the decision maker ought to take. Or we might think of it as fundamentally about establishing evidence of some past wrongdoing, of like, if you could have done better in the past, then maybe you're liable for discrimination. And there's some ambiguity about which of these the law is referring to when it talks about when people talk about less discriminatory alternatives. And I'll just note, I'll use less discriminatory alternative to mean the general phenomenon that predates computing of settling disparate impact case law, and less discriminatory algorithm is sort of the same thing, but when we're talking about algorithms specifically. Okay, so broadly, this less discriminatory algorithm or LDA seems to be a well-specified request. There seems to be a clear normative problem, and it seems easy to turn it into a technical or automatic process. And as decision makers increasingly use algorithms, it seems that this question should only become more relevant and well specified, whether there exists an alternative policy that's fair without sacrificing much or any accuracy. And so the requirements are same or better performance and lower disparity. And I'll note that for disparity here, I'm using selection rate disparity across groups. So if you have a population with two groups, uh, the disparity is the difference in selection in group-specific selection rates. And there have been other pieces of work that have taken a very similar line of analysis, but with other instantiations of these requirements. So especially Talia Gillis and Burke Uston and collaborators have a great paper where they think about the less discriminatory algorithm, but they use outcome-based notions of fairness, so like false positive rate, false negative rate requirements. We're inspired by the lending context where often you only observe uh, the like selection rate, and it might take 20 years or more to observe whether somebody actually paid back their mortgage in full. And so often selection rate is used, but there are a lot of interesting results across different fairness metrics. Okay, so I have one more slide about why this concept is promising. It seems that in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of this particular doctrine, establishing discrimination requires sometimes identifying a less discriminatory algorithm. More generally, it seems like a good idea to find one. And finally, recent work on quote unquote model multiplicity suggests that there's a significant amount of flexibility in the way that we set up classification policies or binary policies. And maybe we can leverage some of this to make conclusions about their existing less discriminatory alternative policies. And this model multiplicity idea comes with, there are a number of different names that people use. Some people talk about the Rashomon effect or underspecification, but broadly, it's the idea that there's significant flexibility in how machine learning policies are set up. Okay, so the work that we put forward on this topic identifies a number of fundamental limits to the search for less discriminatory algorithms, and I'll talk very broadly about three of these. The first is a statistical challenge that firms commit to their policy using only limited information. Often they have a fixed data set on some past population. Then there's some time at which they use that policy, and the outcomes of their use of that policy or their deployment of the policy might instantiate a disparate impact case. So it can seem natural to use the population that was affected by disparate impact as your population for searching for the less discriminatory algorithm, but that information wasn't available to firms at the time that they committed to their policy. And so there are a number of tricky problems to using that information in order to make any claim about whether there existed an alternative policy available to firms at the time they designed their policy. And so you sort of get into this statistical challenge of making inferences um, uh, using more information than what the firm had when they designed their policy. The second challenge is a computational challenge. So even if we just strip away all of the statistical uncertainty and we just think about finding an alternative binary policy on a fixed data set with full labels, we find that arriving at the least discriminatory possible classifier over this data set, given some initial classifier, runs into these combinatoric issues and is NP-hard in general. And the third challenge is a mathematical challenge that it is sometimes impossible to achieve disparity reductions at a given level of accuracy. And just to provide intuition for this kind of simple observation, if we imagine like the optimal classifier or a Bayes optimal, if we imagine the optimal classifier on a labeled data set, as long as there are differences in base rates, that classifier will have some non-zero selection rate disparity. Um, so, in spite of these limits, we still find that there's quite a lot that can be done, even if we can't sort of like specify a perfect search process. There are many opportunities for arriving at better alternatives and less discriminatory alternatives in practice. So, in light of the statistical challenge, we find that like using sort of the machine learning paradigm and trying to project accuracy and disparity using the data set that the firm had access to, it's still possible to make inferences, especially when the sort of like model class um, uh, and various assumptions that the firm made are kept constant. In light of the second challenge, the computational challenge, we provide an approximation algorithm that's like a full polynomial time approximation. And in light of the third challenge, the mathematical challenge, we find that this limit is really only binding at nearly perfect accuracy. And we make this sort of more formal. And I'll talk about this third mathematical challenge today, but I refer everybody to the paper for broader discussion. Okay, so diving into this mathematical challenge, what I'm calling the mathematical challenge, um, as I sort of mentioned, we can think about the set of classifiers in informal terms by sort of stripping away certain complexities in ways that are generous to the firm or the decision maker. So we imagine that we don't have any uncertainty over the data, and our entire population is captured in a fixed data set. If we make these very generous assumptions, then given some data set, we can see all of the individuals who are positively and negatively labeled and what group they belong to. And so on the left is a simple table representing a toy data set where there are 50 individuals. And for example, 15 of those individuals have a positive outcome or outcome label and belong to group one. And using only this information, we're able to map in accuracy and disparity space the set of all classifiers over the 50 individuals. So just enumerate the set of all classifiers over the 50 individuals, and this information is enough to give us the disparity and utility values for each of these classifiers. And so the plot on the right represents this enumeration, and we can imagine it being very dense in the cloud and a little bit more sparse on the edges. But it's sort of clear to see that this geometric object has sort of a polygon shape if we like connect all of the outer points. And if we imagine that instead of just having deterministic classifiers, we allow random classifiers over the individuals, then the sort of center figure is the same set of achievable points, but shaded in. And this is an eight-sided polygon, and we can sort of precisely characterize as a function of this information the sort of perfect accuracy classifier, the perfectly bad classifier, the like perfectly disparate classifier, et cetera, all of these extremes. And in particular, I want to draw attention to this sort of green circle point and the yellow triangle point, because the yellow triangle is the perfect accuracy classifier, and the green circle is the optimal classifier that has zero disparity across populations. And our goal here is to characterize when is it a good faith argument that there doesn't exist a alternative classifier with lower disparity at a certain level of accuracy. And if we think about it, below at any sort of accuracy level below the green point, um, there theoretically exists an alternative classifier that that has zero disparity at the same accuracy level. And this is like, of course, absent any uh, thinking about hypothesis classes or model classes. This is just enumerating the total set of classifiers. And so the finding, put informally, is that there is some threshold utility, that some characteristically close to optimal, below which there exists a zero disparity alternative. And above that point, there still is some line segment representing the sort of Pareto optimal classifiers. And so you still might have a less discriminatory alternative if you're not on that frontier. Okay, and that's sort of the main theoretical finding for that section, but we do a number of empirical tests on common data sets, especially some of which are in this credit uh, and lending context, to find that even simple heuristics like randomly sampling from a population and retraining a classifier or randomizing the seed can at times yield alternatives that are um, uh, lower disparity and higher accuracy. And I refer everyone to the paper for more about this, but I only have time for just show, like sort of flashing these figures. Okay, so you could say all this sounds very neat, but does this mean anything for the real world? And I really like this example. It's a Supreme Court case called Allen v. Milligan. And the story of the case is the following. So Alabama, using the 2020 census information, put forward a new voting map. Um, and in particular, they had seven districts, and only one out of seven of those districts were majority Black. However, their population of voting age individuals was their population of voting age Black citizens was 26%. So the map they put forward had 14% of districts were majority but minority, and this didn't exactly match their population proportion. And so civil rights law has a similar structure to this disparate impact doctrine, where the way the court case happened was a plaintiff came forward and provided an alternative map that they argued met the traditional map drawing standards of compactness, et cetera. But that had two majority minority districts. And Alabama argued in response that from a random set of 2 million potential maps run in a computer simulation, that none had more than one majority minority district. And this just illustrates that the relevance of computation somehow emerges in some of these disparity and discrimination cases. So the decision by Roberts, I think, paints this pretty clearly. He wrote, Alabama misconceives the math project that it expects courts to oversee. A brief submitted by three computational redistricting experts explains that the number of possible districting maps in Alabama is at least in the trillions. Another publication reports the number of potential maps may be orders of magnitude higher. The universe of all possible connected population balanced districting maps that satisfy the state's requirements is likely in the range of Google's. 2 million maps, in other words, is not many maps at all. And Alabama's insistent reliance on that number, however powerful it may sound in the abstract, is thus close to irrelevant in practice. What would the next million maps show, the next billion, the first trillion of all the trillions, all answer those questions. So the point is, even though these rules and procedures around arriving at non-discriminatory policies predate the era of widespread computing, actually adjudicating these cases about whether discrimination has occurred is bumping up against these fundamental questions of algorithms and how to search among this a vast set of policies for less discriminatory alternatives. So the broad takeaway here is there are choices and consequences in how we set up an optimization. Sometimes optimization can provide a sort of like clear and nice way to search through a set of policies. But in any case that we use optimization, there's always some abstraction and sort of stripping away of the complexity of the world. And I just note that I have a different paper on this like general topic of optimization and some of the ethical and social questions that it raises. Okay, so zooming out, I hope that this talk sort of convinces you that that this legal concept requires a computational perspective and touches some pretty deep questions in CS. And further, there's a lot of fascinating questions to ask about what can be achieved over the set of machine learning policies. The last example I gave was about map drawing and the ways to sort of cut through the problem of how you'd draw districts in a state. But even in a case like binary classification, where you might think that the set of policies is sort of simple to state, there's a lot of interesting richness in the set of possible policies that we could arrive at. Okay, so I'll move on to part two, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take those. Okay. All right. So part two is titled The Backfiring Effect of Weak AI Safety Regulation. And my collaborators for this project are John Kleinberg and Hoda Heydari. And the sort of inspiration of this part of the talk is the generative AI context. So moving on from sort of more traditional binary classification setting. And increasingly, we hear these technologies described as a quote unquote general purpose technology. Um, and sort of course, there's some sense in which large language models and related technologies are potentially useful in a swath of downstream uses and domains. But of course, this is sort of like a not a very precise characterization. We know that depending on the context, depending on the purposes and needs and interests in a given domain, the set of reasonable uses for the technology varies. So here is like a very toy example, but if we think about the medical domain, on the left, I've pulled like a image that represents a medical notes summarization task, and there's some initial studies that suggest that LLMs might be good for automating steps in clinical note generation. Versus on the right is like more of maybe a media or Google image search result depiction of a doctor, like an all-knowing robo doctor, um, who still somehow manages to need an iPad for reference for your medical information. But obviously, some uses or some like visions of how AI will evolve are more far-fetched than others. And so, still, the potential uses abound, and we're in a moment where people are suggesting all sorts of downstream um, uses and ideas. And the sort of like key ingredient that I'm trying to get at here is that there does seem to be something important about the fact that one entity produces some pre-trained technology and one or more other entities use it for a particular domain. And so the questions that we're interested in asking with this project are when we're trying to regulate the technology, should these regulations target the upstream producer, the downstream domain specific implementation or adaptation of the technology, both or neither? And what are the implications for welfare, safety, and performance? And so um, the basic ingredients here build on a model that we put forward in a prior paper from a year or two ago, which we called fine-tuning games. And it's sort of as I described. You have a generalist, which we call G, that puts forward a general technology, and that general technology may be adapted to one or multiple domains by individual specialists, which we call D, and we index for each specialist. And we imagine that these are different entities, and they might have different capabilities. So G might have access to data or engineering talent or compute. And the domain specialists might have domain expertise or problem familiarity, designated staff, etc. And the key thing here is that one entity produces and the others adapt or tune the technology. And this sort of suggests that there's a latent strategic interaction. So you might imagine that D1's decision of whether to enter and adapt the technology depends on the performance that the generalist brought the technology to. But the performance that the generalist brought the technology to depends on which specialists will enter the deal. And so there are further complexities like D1's decision to enter might depend on D2's, the size of D2 or the amount of profit D2 brings in. So this led to a sort of game theoretic model that was sort of Stackelberg style, but proceeds in three steps. In the final step, the domain specialist brings the technology to some final performance level. In the second to last step, the generalist brings the technology from zero um, to some baseline performance level. And in the initial step, the generalist and the domain specialist have to bargain over how much profit they receive as a result of the end technology. So it's sort of similar to some models that you see in the contract literature in economics. And the question that we want to introduce today is using this baseline model, how should we think about regulation? And so if this was the original fine-tuning games model, now we imagine a regulator R, and the regulator R chooses who among these players to target. Is there any questions so far? Alrighty, I'll keep going. So, so we revise our original game, and we it as follows. So a regulator announces regulation, and we're not thinking about the regulator's strategy per se. So we can sort of imagine that regulation is exogenous to the game and just gets announced, and that sort of starts the game. After the regulation is announced, there's the regulation takes the form of a threshold. So there might be a threshold on the generalist, a threshold on the specialist, both or neither. And uh, the rest of the game is identical, except that instead of the entire game taking place over um, one dimension, which we called performance in the original game, we imagine that the technology is described by two attributes, which we call performance and safety, and the regulation provides a minimum threshold or a floor on the safety attribute. And so uh, otherwise, the revenue and cost functions are the same. Each player has some characteristic cost as a function of their investment. The revenue is a function of the ultimate performance and safety of the technology. And the utilities of each player are their bargain share of the revenue minus their cost. And as a sort of concrete instantiation of this model, we can imagine the case of quadratic costs. So we allow any quadratic function to represent the g and d's costs, and they can differ from each other. And we imagine the revenue can be a linear function of alpha and beta. And this is just one example of a family of functions we could use to analyze the model. Okay. And just as a rough illustration of what this looks like, cost is increasing um, uh, uh, like exponentially with performance, and revenue is increasing linearly. This is, of course, a one-dimensional version, so it's more similar to our original fine-tuning games model, but you can imagine two-dimensional quadratics um, capturing these similar dynamics. Okay. And so this slide, I think, represents some of the qualitative takeaways from the game. And we were actually kind of uh, pleasantly surprised at some of the results that we didn't really expect when we had set up the problem. And so on the top left, this is like one example of a game. So it's not general, but it's an example. In this example, there's one generalist and three specialists. The generalist strategy is depicted in blue, and the specialist strategy is depicted in green. The performance safety space is the sort of like grid over which the players are navigating. And the generalist strategy without any regulation is to bring the technology to something like 0.75, 0.75. And then the specialist cost function and revenue outlook is such that they bring the technology to three different points in the space. And so just looking, like moving over to from the top left plot, which depicts no regulation, to the top right plot, which depicts regulation only targeted at the domain specialist, we might ask what happens when we put a safety floor on the domain specialist at 1.2 in this example. And even though the regulation just requires a floor on safety, and 2 out of 3 of the specialists already cleared that floor, so they already meet the regulation still profoundly changes the strategies in the game. And the reason for that is order of play. The generalist goes first and decides the safety and performance levels before the domain specialists move. And so if there's a floor on safety, the generalist knows that that floor must be met. And so this constraint on the specialist's strategies allows the generalist to free ride and not invest anything into safety because they know the specialists have to meet the floor. And so it becomes worthwhile to do these strategies that can actually lead the technology to be less safe than it would be with no regulation at all. And this we think is pretty interesting, and we call it backfiring. Um, on the lower left, we depict the case where you only regulate the generalist. This has less of an interesting effect, but it raises the safety level across all three domains. And on the lower right, we have a policy where we regulate both. And here, this is like the best of the four depicted in terms of the safety levels of the technology. And so the point is, in the top right, we see one domain improve its safety, but the two others backfire. In the bottom row, all domains improve. And so reasoning about how to target regulation can help us identify these risks or pitfalls to um, not smartly placed regulation along the AI development chain. And so the first finding, which I've already sort of spoken to a little bit, but that is more general than just the example I gave, is that a fine-tuning, first defining backfiring, a fine-tuning game exhibits backfiring if and only if there exists a regulatory safety threshold such that the game yields lower safety than it would in the absence of regulation. And the finding is that for all non-trivial games with quadratic costs, there exists some weak regulatory regime directed at the domain specialist that lowers safety. And this is sort of an informal statement. For example, I haven't defined non-trivial. You can imagine games where the two players would invest zero in safety without any regulation, and in that case, um, the regulation would never be able to backfire. But it's surprising how wide a swath of games seem to exhibit this effect. And of course, the effect is is for certain regulatory thresholds and directed at the specialist. And I referred to the paper, which is now on archive. We're actively working on it, but we have some simulation results and numerical results that depict some of these effects. And in this sort of figure, we vary the threshold on safety, and we keep track of the ultimate safety level of the technology as the result of a game. And in this particular game, again, we observe a backfiring effect for a variety of bargaining parameters. Okay, so you might say, well, this seems to be bleak for the prospect of regulating AI. Should we not regulate at all? And in sort of contrast to this backfiring result, we find that the regulation actually, um, when it's well placed, can mutually benefit the players. So there exists some regulatory regime that's different from the backfiring regulatory regime that not only improves safety, but also Pareto improves the players' utilities. And this is again simulation results varying the sort of strategy, the regulations and the bargains for a characteristic for a particular game. But the point here is to show that um, uh, the players can be made better off, and the reason for this is um, the regulation can act as a commitment device. So by constraining the strategy space of each of the two players, the players are constrained away from strategies that would otherwise be sort of free riding or kind of benefiting at the expense of the other player. And if they're able to commit to restricting their strategies, they actually can end up both better off. And so we observed that well-placed regulation can sort of have this Pareto improving effect and can avoid these like prisoner dilemma dynamics that arise in the game. So broadly, other takeaways and insights here are sometimes regulating safety can improve performance and otherwise it can diminish it. So I haven't talked at all really about the effect on performance, the other attribute of the technology. I've really only talked about safety and the utilities so far. And the effect on performance, you might assume that like regulation just diminishes innovation and therefore performance would go down. But this depends on the function forms. It depends on the like cross terms in our quadratic functions. And so we try to get a little bit more precise in the paper about um, when regulation improves performance and when it diminishes it. And we provide some numerical results on this cross term analysis. And second, sometimes regulating, if all you care about is performance and safety, sometimes regulating the specialist is quote unquote all you need for achieving these combinations. And other times it's preferable to target both players with regulation. But we think the broad takeaway here is there are all sorts of issues that come up when we only look at policies that target the specialist. And so directing some regulation upstream seems like a good idea. And again, like the last part of the talk, you might ask, okay, this is all great. You've provided a theoretical model of something, but does this mean anything for the real world? And again, the sort of strategic implications of these various players along the AI supply chain have come up in very real policy settings. So, in California, there was a bill that was proposed that didn't become the law called SB 1047. And this bill provided very specific stipulations for what constitutes a fine tuner and what constitutes a sort of generalist or base model, and it provided conditions for when liability and regulation should be targeted at one or the other. And I think it was something like fine tuners that spend more than $10 million should be liable for harms, and otherwise the generalist is liable, something like this. And of course, you could ask all sorts of strategic incentive style questions about this arrangement. And so we hope that our model provides some intuition for what are the considerations for reasoning about when we should direct regulation up or down the supply chain. And we're still working on this, but some future steps include more complex regulatory rules and regimes, much like this California bill. And in a project led by Tori Q at CMU, we're exploring a model of openness and open source decisions in the sort of generalist strategy space. So zooming out, um, I hope that this talk has provided some interesting like food for thought about the role of conceptual mathematical models in sort of societal or regulatory contexts, especially around the development of AI. I think these models and approaches are imperfect, but they are absolutely needed and kind of inevitable, because any time that a regulator or policymaker tries to set up some sort of policy, they're doing abstraction in some sense and need to think through a model of what's really going on. And um, more broadly, the development patterns of AI and machine learning technologies are not fully understood by any means. So we don't fully know what forms these technologies will take or what features they will have or how to measure them or what to prioritize or think about. And so I feel strongly that formalisms and abstractions can sort of help us understand um, which downstream uses are viable, which directions are important, and how to regulate or think about societal implications. That's it. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great talk. So we have like about 5 minutes right now if there are any questions. Yeah, I guess there is no question right now. Let me end the recording super quickly.